Very welcome to this first event in the new seminar series organized by IHOPE with a number of collaborating departments. The name of the seminar series is AFRHES, Africa Historical Ecology. We're so honored and privileged to have Professor Innocent Pikirayi to join us here. So Professor Innocent Pikirayi is Professor of Archaeology at Pretoria University, and he has a broad interest in social complexity, geoarchaeology, historical archaeology, human-environmental relationships. And Innocent, please go on. And I'm also personally very happy to welcome Innocent because he's an alumni from Uppsala University, where I'm active. And when I came to Uppsala, you defended your thesis. So I feel like I'm still following in your tracks. So very glad to have you here. And over to you, Innocent.
Thank you so much, Annalie, and colleagues. A very good afternoon to you all. It is more than a pleasure for me to speak to not just to Uppsala, but to IHOPE on work that is currently going on at Great Zimbabwe, and for which I am the lead investigator. If I can share my screen with you. Are you able to see my screen?
Perfect.
All right. Now, this is the topic that I've been asked to talk about. I've been actually struggling on the title in terms of what to say, but thanks for the good suggestion. And what you will hear from me is the usage of the word we, the collective we, because it's not just my own work, but it is collaborative work with all these people, and for whom and institutions, and for whom I'm sincerely grateful. Let me also mention that I'm overtly grateful in this project to my colleague Federica Sulas. When it came to the collaboration starting from at Pretoria and leading us to to Great Zimbabwe and other avenues in terms of meeting, you simply reignited my interest in geomorphology, and going back to my early years as a student, where I did a bit of structural geology, aspects of which I'm going to share with you today. So thank you so much, Federica, for that. And I'm slowly beginning to get new ideas about Great Zimbabwe and the Great Zimbabwe culture, and beyond conventional archaeology in terms of how we should be looking at this very complex site and part of a complex society. Now, for some of you who might not be familiar with Great Zimbabwe, it dates from the early 2nd millennium AD and was at the helm of a very large civilization in Southern Africa. And if you look at it from a broader context of Africa, Great Zimbabwe is part of a large number of kingdoms and empires that you find on the continent, which developed in the last 3 to 4,000 years. Now, my story really is about the paper that I did with a number of people, some of whom are in the audience. I can mention Federica Sulas and Ezekiel Mteto. Really a scoping paper on water in ancient Great Zimbabwe, which really was prompted by these features that you see around Great Zimbabwe, particularly around the core monumental structures such as the hill complex and the Great Enclosure. Now, we interpreted these structures as water storage facilities at Great Zimbabwe, but of course, initially, many researchers had suggested, or have been suggesting, that this is where clay for building material was sourced, and then the pits would be left like that. We are not disputing that, but we are saying over and above that, what you potentially see here is that, instead of rehabilitating these features, they had other more purposeful functions, and this is to share the resource that is, to conserve the resource that is water. So what we were then doing was actually curiosity-driven research or approach to, some of these features, but also trying to address issues to do with what happened to Great Zimbabwe, post its prime. Could it have declined in one way or the other? Was there an element of collapse and things like that? So it was part and parcel of a project on the collapse of complex societies in Africa, and we had picked up Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe, as well as Axiom. So there's another paper which is in the offing as far as this research is concerned, titled Climate Smart Harvesting and Storing of Water and the Legacy of Dhaka Peace, at Great Zimbabwe. And this paper is currently under review, and it is part of that story that I'm going to share with you, but extending beyond the substance of that paper into the granite landscape. So what I'm going to say today, or to do in this presentation, is to engage with you in terms of ongoing hydrogeological studies, that you find at Great Zimbabwe, which is a context that is characterized by, crystalline rock formations. And I want to try and situate Great Zimbabwe's location within that landscape, which is already known, but sort of giving sort of a geo-archaeological perspective as well as a geo-hydrological perspective of Great Zimbabwe. So what I'm doing here is to treat Great Zimbabwe in terms of its water or aquatic ecology. So that's, the highlight of the paper. Now, when one looks at granite, traditionally from an archaeological perspective, when Great Zimbabwe is invoked, or when other stone walls of the Great Zimbabwe tradition are invoked, granite or whatever stone is used to build these structures is seen as building material. But what I'm going to do, and what we're trying to do since 2016, is to look at water around Great Zimbabwe. But now, what we have added is a dimension that looks at the relationship between water and granite. And that relationship says water is also a resource as far as the granite is concerned. So there is a link between granite and water. So from the traditional archaeological perspective of where we see Great Zimbabwe, or the Great Zimbabwe residents exfoliating the landscape around them, shaping it, building stone walls, we also see now, we now see them exploiting water from the same landscape. Hence, granite is of that importance. From a geographical point of view, when one looks at, Great Zimbabwe, and this is the core Great Zimbabwe, the hill complex and the Great Enclosure, what interests me here is the drainage. You see some streams are going that direction, some are going in this direction, others are going the southern direction, the others are in the northern and the eastern direction. What you have here is a radial drainage pattern. Now, radial drainage patterns are normally associated with raised landforms, such as volcanic cones, stratovolcanoes, for example, and that implies rapid runoff. And it also implies very limited storage of water. So that by extension implies that we should have within, if you've got humans living within those contexts, water storage or water conservation is very important. So to understand that, the approaches that we used in researching Great Zimbabwe in the granite context, we used the traditional landscape surveys over and above the geoarchaeological surveys, and in this context, using geology to try and characterize the granite landscape. And some of you have actually participated in the archaeological excavations we did in 2018, I think, yes, and for which there is a publication that gives some snippets as to what is to come, looking at the status of peripheral settlements within the Great Zimbabwe site complex. And more interestingly, what we did prior to that, but the results of which have increasingly become available, is the LiDAR scan, where we're trying to understand the built environment in relation to water resources, as well as any other environmental aspect or issue that may arise. It all depends on how you strip, sort of in literally naked, the LiDAR that is available for you. Now, our landscape surveys included community engagement, that is engaging with the local people living around Great Zimbabwe, in terms of water resources. These are the geoarchaeological surveys where soil samplings, soil profiling to understand landscape changes were done. The excavations, looking at the status of peripheral settlements, and then a bit of a snippet on the LiDAR scans. Now, very quickly in terms of the results, what did we get from the landscape surveys, right? Now, if you engage with the local communities around Great Zimbabwe, what you get is really a rich tapestry of histories of, toponyms. By here, I'm talking about place names, a rich tapestry of place hydronyms, names of streams and rivers, and all of them pointing to the importance of water, both in the past and in the present. And the point here is that if you listen to those narratives, to those histories, water is as important for domestic, consumption and agriculture as it is used for any life forms in that particular area. And water is also something that is regulated by ritual, is regulated by community sanction, and is also regulated by way of ceremony. So there's a link between ritual and water conservation. Then some of the springs are owned by clans who, on the basis of that, also claim ownership of Great Zimbabwe. And there's the famous Chisikana Spring, which is located right, in the heart of, Great Zimbabwe, which has got a history of interaction with one of the clans. I think it's the Nemanwa clan, and the Nemanwa is one of the groups that claims ownership of Great Zimbabwe. Now, in terms of, more landscape surveys, as I said, you have got toponyms and hydronyms. The intricate connection, there's an intricate connection between water and bare rock. And the local names for bare rock there is Maware, right, or Matombo. And then this is, entangled in local community worldviews where water comes from rocks, not the biblical one in terms of Numbers, the book of Numbers, where Moses hits the rock and water comes out. These are early forms of miracles, and Dr. Mtetwa, we can engage on that. But here I'm talking about Chitubu or Chitubu. These are springs where water is emanating from the rocks. But more interestingly, what you get is that during the normal rain season, when rains fall, and during the off season, when you get drizzles or guti in local terms, communities don't look at water in terms of runoff, but water is something that is fed into the granites. And then, it is fed into the rocks, it is fed into the bare rock, which is Maware. And then it then comes out through the rocks. So it's part of a ritualized, understood, owned cultural landscape where the relationship between water, people, and other forms of nature is perfectly understood. Now, this then calls us to try and understand, the geological surveys, the geoarchaeological surveys, from a normal characterization of granite landforms. And it takes us a bit to geoarchaeology. How do you characterize the landscapes around you? And in this case, how do you characterize the landscapes around Great Zimbabwe? Now, if you look at this schematic diagram here, it shows you in this gray color here, something undulating. Now, this is what granites, how granites can be, presented schematically, with some of these huge rocks that we can be called in various names. Locally in Zimbabwe, we've got Ruware or Maware or Dombo. And then Bonat, I think these are some of the names that are used in Europe. But in English, there's usage of the term Welbeck, just to show how the outcrop, when they are, when they appear from the basement, from the bedrock, they look like wells that are dipping into water or emerging from the water. Now, associated with these landscapes, you also have, rocks that have been referred to as castle copies. These are rocks with rectangular jointing, of blocks that have been severed through weathering, but you can actually see them there. They're normally about 30 to 40 meters high, and then almost closer to the ground, rocks which outcrop here and there, they are sometimes referred to as nubins. And again, these landforms are easy to see at Great Zimbabwe, from your Welbeck copy to castle copies to nubins. Yes, several places you find nubins, Welbeck copies here, castle copies, all over. That's the characteristic of the, sort of the raised landscape. Now, between those raised landscape is the plains, which have been formed through a process, of peniplanation, and we call them H-plains. And these are the ones that connect the Welbeck copies with the, with the plains. And I'll show you later how that happens. So basically, this is how we characterize the landscape in and around Great Zimbabwe, using terminology that is already available, but with local terms. So you've got the bare rock surfaces, the Welbecks, and the hill complex is one of them. The castle copies or the tolls, this is Shikomo, these are the smaller hills. And then the much smaller hills, the Nubins or Shikomonyana, right? Now, what is critical here, because I've already alluded to some of these issues, is that while all these formations appear as individual structures, they're actually interlinked below. That is why I showed you in this slide, this sort of curvature here. They're interlinked below the plains or the H-plains as solid granite basins. And this is why it is critical for us to understand what happens underneath when you're looking at Great Zimbabwe, and then what happens beyond the pits, also when you're looking at Great Zimbabwe. So between those hills that you have been seeing, between those big, large and small hills, there is a process that is going on, a sort of a natural withering, degrading process, and it's called explanation, right? And this is the results of what you get when you look at flat areas of soils, between the hills, right? This is alteration that is going on, and it is reflecting what is also happening in the subsurface. Right? Now, there are some areas of Great Zimbabwe where ash plains, or simply the plains, become marshy during the rain season, resulting in localized soil developments. This is due to the decomposition that happens there, because there's a lot of vegetable material there, and that is responsible for altering the upper soil horizons. Now, all this geomorphological knowledge requires us to then engage with the crystalline basement rocks on which Great Zimbabwe is. And we, from a geological point of view, we know what they are. Just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of depth, there are rocks that are formed several kilometers below the surface. And when we see them here, they're actually exposed as outcrops. And these are the most dominant rocks that you find, on the Zimbabwe Plateau. And they're referred to as, the granites of the Zimbabwe Craton. Now, this inset here also shows you that in South Africa, the High Veld particularly, going east towards Mozambique through Swaziland and the northern KwaZulu-Natal province, you do get, similar rocks. This is what is called the Calval Craton. This craton there that you see here is the Zimbabwe Craton, which is this one. These are basically your granites and gneiss. And what is interesting, in these rocks is their profile, right? Knowledge which is very well known since the mid-1980s, extensively researched, and there have been several attempts in the past 20 or so years, until very recently, to try and understand how this profile looks, the density in terms of the fracture from the top to the bottom, and also the porosity and permeability of these particular rocks. I'm just going to give you two examples in terms of what the ideal profile is and the hydrogeological models that people, researchers have profiled. So from the top, you get rocks that are completely withered, right down to the fresh bedrock. And in between, you get grades of withering from completely withered to moderately withered to slightly withered, right? So which means that when you look at it when you look at such profile from a permeability perspective, and here I'm now looking at the hydrogeological model, you start in the normal soil horizon, getting high permeability of water. And then as you go down, through the regolith, and this is the withered profile, you get low permeability. And then where you get a lot of fracture, the permeability becomes very high. Now, the same applies to the porosity. There is a decrease in porosity as you reach bedrock, and this is really common. It's fairly logical to see why. Now, when you look at porosity, just a quick one here, is that the overburden does have high porosity, and high to medium and low permeability. And this is known. These are the studies of the last 10 to 12 years. And then where you get the, the composite rock or the widget fractured rocks, aquifers start developing from there. This is where water is stored, right? So when saturated, the rock below, the overburden is where the reservoir, the aquifer develops. And the regolith zone slowly feeds water downwards into fractures in the bedrock, right? And as I indicated earlier on, there is a decrease in terms of profile fracture density as one goes down. And so the same applies with the porosity. And this is very important in terms of understanding the behavior of water down the sort of the granite. Now, in general, because of their medium to low porosity, crystalline rocks have modest water resources in their aquifers. And they are not comparable in terms of water storage when it comes to limestone or volcanic aquifers. And in general, too, granites are poor aquifers because they are not very permeable. They've got a very low permeability. But to make good aquifers, their subsurface horizons have to be highly fractured. So it is really the degree of fracturing that determines the extent to which granites can make good aquifers. There's also a big but in the sense that there are some crystalline rocks that have exceptionally good flows, or high flows, of water. And this is known globally. The studies of the last 6 to 8 years, 6 to 10 to 12 years have indicated this. And such water can be quite considerable in terms of amount that it can actually support large cities, large villages. And so what we are saying here is that there are exceptions when you're looking at some crystalline rocks in terms of their water supply below. For us in sub-Saharan Africa, which relies very much on groundwater, and a region that is both economically and physically water scarce, particularly in the arid regions, right? Groundwater is very critical. Now, it's even more critical when we're talking about access to it and when it is easily accessible. Now, when it is not very deep, again, this is a factor because it becomes relatively inexpensive, to extract. So harvesting of such water is important, particularly through exit points. You can harvest it through a spring and whatever. It is very important because it shows you how accessible that water is. So wells are important in this regard. Now you might even ask, where am I going with this? When we mention wells, these are our normal harvesting points of water in crystalline and other contexts. But as an archaeologist, this is where I'm taking you to, the results of the LiDAR scanning, where not only did we manage to map more of these structures that we call, dhaka pits or storage reservoirs, but we've been also able to estimate the volumes of the pits that you see all over, the site of Great Zimbabwe, in terms of depth, and the ability to, the potential volume of water that, each of these pits was likely to, you know, to have held. What we also managed to find, you know, or at least to read from the LiDAR, and this is a stripped image that shows you exactly what lies below. Of course, we do have some of these structures that the LiDAR is able to, you know, normal archaeological surveys are able to show, but some of these streams here are not visible to the naked eye anymore. They lie below the subsurface. This one from the hill complex here down is fairly well known, but it's only through the LiDAR that its character is fairly very clear. And even from there, the stream density that you see here up to this particular point is not visible to the to the naked eye. It's only through the LiDAR. So we know of their springs. We know of that there are springs, there are wells, and there are these particular pits. Now, more on the LiDAR scanning. Now, several close depressions or the pits have been revealed. We've seen some of these dhaka pits before, but the majority had not been mapped before the LiDAR scans. Then the water stream channel network that I've shown you before, what is crucial here also, apart from the density, is that the streams flow from granite hills and pass through, and let me take you, they pass through some of these pits here, some of these reservoirs. They pass through from here down, from here through, and going down. So this is a critical observation. So what we're saying is that the pits lie in positions that maximize the collection of surface runoff and retain water in the vicinity of the ancient settlement, right? So that was one of our observations earlier on, that this location of these pits is sort of strategic in terms of collecting runoff. But beyond that, I want to argue that the pits are also tapping into the aquifer of Great Zimbabwe. And this is informed by the excavations that we did in one of the peripheral enclosures. This is the settlement of Chenga, where we realized that while the residents of Great Zimbabwe use some of the regolith or the soil, the clay soils that you find from the profile, from the deep profile that you find from the gullies as well as from some of the pits, for the construction of houses. What we seem to be getting here is that there is the use of the structures, the dhaka pits, right, to exploit subsurface water. So it was not just the exploitation of groundwater resources where the water would flow in and fill into the pits, but I would want to argue that the dhaka pits were also part and parcel of the exploitation of subsurface water. I'm sorry about this particular slide, is too dense, but I think I can take you through it in the sense that, what I'm mentioning here is a critical discussion points, in terms of what Great Zimbabwe offers us now, that what we have is granite outcrop and explanation. And then you've got runoff percolating into the plain and then re-emerging as springs and accumulating in some areas in terms of swamps. So it should be logical to say Great Zimbabwe lies on an aquifer, which can either be confined or unconfined in terms of both. But if we agree that it lies on an aquifer, what we then have to do at some stage is to determine the size of the aquifer. Right now, what we can simply say is that there are some springs with a high discharge rate, others with modest or low rates, while others have dried up. It shows you how active that aquifer is and whether one can call it a large, medium, or small. It depends on the rate of discharge that eventually fills into these pits. Then, of course, we do have the profiles which we have done, the soil profiles that we have done as part of the geoarchaeological investigations, starting from the word go. One of the soil profiles that I've shown above there in these particular slides shows reddish orange coarse-grained. It's actually coarse-grained to medium sandy clay, right? And is actually developing from withered granite or basalt material. It is this profile which I want to say is aquiferous in nature, because when we did the surveys, I was actually able to say I could see some of these context yielding water, some of these context containing water, and some of them actually conveying water to nearby rivers. The other profile which Dr. Frederica and I did, and also other colleagues did, show something different, but crucially is associated with anthropogenic modifications that takes place within Great Zimbabwe. So they are commonly associated with archaeological context, and that is to be expected. So we've got the standard geologic, geomorphological profile, where water is coming from, where water is yielded, and where water is conveyed, and then the disturbed profile, right? So I link this with sort of recent studies on sort of crystalline basement aquifers in tropical and subtropical regions. And again, this is research that has been ongoing from the late 90s into the 2000s. But what you will see from this particular research is that the focus is on borehole yields in relation to topography. Where do you get much of the water? Where do you get less of the water if you locate a borehole? Now, such studies are very important to me, because the point that I want to ask is, how did Great Zimbabwe residents identify fractured zones then and zones that yielded water? How come we're only beginning to realize it now, when scientists are beginning to say, if you dig crystalline rocks in this way, this is how best you can get water? So we do have, a 1,000-year gap in terms of indigenous knowledge systems, where, we seem not to acknowledge that some of this knowledge was already there before the, arrival of Western science. Now, let me digress a little bit, because I want to conclude, not immediately, but after a point or two, by looking at sort of the current global water outlook, where the World Economic Forum says, or said, I think that was just pre-COVID, that the crisis that is currently, the water crisis that is currently faced by the globe, by the world, in terms of the economies, in terms of the environments, and in terms of human society, will be a problem of the next decade. In other words, now, I think, or maybe the 2030s plus. Well, the issue is the world is already experiencing that particular crisis, right? We already see water stresses, reduced river flow. We're already seeing in so many areas spring or reservoir depletion. Cape Town being a city that nearly experienced ground zero. Not ground zero, but day zero in terms of water supply. And all what is happening is threat to settlement growth, because people might leave such settlements if they find they don't have any water to sustain on. So the point is, water is more than just a climate issue. It is something that can potentially lead to conflicts. It affects people's movement, mobilities. It impacts on ecosystems. It affects economies and so many issues. I'm fascinated by this and other images coming from Europe in terms of what is happening to the Rhine, and as well as the Danube, some of the two river systems that always excite me when I get into Central Europe, because I want to sail on these particular river systems. Now I'm told that the ships have to move in these rivers with reduced ballast, right? It's an interesting development, as much as it is traumatizing, to see people having to contend with water losses or water shortages in this particular way. Now, back to Great Zimbabwe, in terms of water scenarios, one can simply say that Great Zimbabwe lies in a water scarce region that is known, but how long has this been water scarce? It all depends on how you look at climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southern Africa, and in Central Africa. What we know for sure, and this is a point that is never going to change, this is a limited catchment. That's where Great Zimbabwe is. It has to store, it has to conserve its water. If it was in the past, that was the people did. Then water needs of that particular, ancient city must have grown, with the growth of the city. That is a permutation which is almost a fact. And one can also safely argue that water was central to its economy, as much as it was central to its political stability and the broader ecosystem. What I can also say confidently, because it is we're coming from a region where droughts and dry periods are known to have existed in history, Great Zimbabwe must have experienced this as well, including climate change, right? So the point is that the building of reservoirs, such as the dhaka pits, actually point to the responses, that people had to do when they wanted, a more reassuring and a more permanent supply of water. But building such reservoirs means that the granite was as important to the residents as much as it was to the reservoirs. So one cannot look at the granite, at the reservoirs, without looking at the granite. So the question is, was Great Zimbabwe ever confronted by a water crisis? Now, my answer is, well, it depends on how you look at or how you address issues of climate change in the long durée, how you address issues to do with water retention in contexts such as crystalline context, and how you look at the potential of storage facilities that we call dhaka pits. There are so many permutations that one can say. So in terms of reflecting on water ecology, and ancient complex societies, these are some of the questions that I might want to raise here, the insights that one can get, for better understanding and responses to contemporary climate change or crisis. Looking at the long durée, for example. The second point is, how should we use the past to understand, contemporary crisis in urbanization? Great Zimbabwe being an urban center, which may have experienced depletion of population, which may have experienced abandonment of some kind, but a population, a site which we find largely silent, when records become available. And the point number 3 is, how should we understand decline or collapse of complex societies? For us to invoke these terms, how should we be looking at Great Zimbabwe, for example? How should we be reading such signals from the archaeology, from the geoarchaeology, from the context that I'm talking about? Now, there's so much to say in this particular context, but I don't have answers as yet. What I've tried to do here is to set up a conversation, a dialogue that will allow us to think about Great Zimbabwe differently. But beyond that, whether you can call it a decolonized approach to Great Zimbabwe or what, and I've refrained from using that word. But what I'm doing here is providing a fresh look at the site that makes it possible for you and I as scholars, but us scholars and the public to be able to engage on the same platform to understand Great Zimbabwe. So that's my story, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank, once again, my colleague Frederica, particularly, and the team at EBNET. They invited me it was 2019 as visiting professor there, and some of the ideas that I'm developing here were actually, nurtured there. And then I hope Annelie for the invitation. This research was actually funded by the National Research Foundation and the African Humanities Program, which supported fieldwork and travel. So thank you so much. Then this is my contribution to this seminar.
Thank you very much, Innocent, and very interesting. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. So if you have a question, you can raise the hand in the reactions function, or you indicate to me that you have a question. I think I see a hand. Ezekiel, yes.
Well, thank you so much, Prof, for taking the water issue to such dizzy heights. I remember the field works that we did in 2016 together with Federica, as she was actually introducing some of us to geoarchaeology within the project that you are continuing in. And many thanks to the insights that you have brought up. Very interesting indeed. My immediate question concerns whether you have observed any shifts or any relationship in terms of the distribution and concentration of settlements or houses or domestic infrastructure in relation to the water infrastructure that you are highlighting. Do you see any shifts in the distribution and concentration of domestic infrastructure shaping or being reshaped by the development of the water infrastructure itself? How do these two relate at Great Zimbabwe?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ezekiel, for that question. In fact, these are the next steps in terms of what we plan to do. But already what we are beginning to see when one looks at the pits, particularly around the hill complex, and relating those pits to the inner and outer perimeter walls. Now, the interpretation that we have proffered for these walls was that as the site was growing, settlement was also growing outwards, and there was need to demarcate between what was happening within the core elite settlement and the non-elite, structures, which were situated between largely between the inner and outer perimeter wall. But when you look at the water infrastructure, it sort of displaces that notion by actually presenting those as water conservation sort of structures, sort of excluding residential settlement from a vital resource. In other words, what people are doing there, and one can say that with a degree of confidence, is that they're trying to protect the resource from settlement encroachment. So we are already beginning to interrogate some of the sort of spatial models proffered by Huffman and others, in terms of how we look at space at Great Zimbabwe. So there is need to look at Great Zimbabwe and water and spatial settlement distribution. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Kesale. You are muted, so unmute yourself if you have a comment. Kesale.
Thank you very much, Professor Innocent Pikirayi. My interest is on your reflections, especially on the second point, which highlights how we can learn from the past for contemporary the contemporary urban crisis. And my interest, Professor, is in the formation of informal settlements, informality, in relation to using Great Zimbabwe as a reference on how, if possible, we can ameliorate the informal settlements, because I believe one of the reasons why we have, for example, I am from Zambia, Lusaka, and there's a special informal settlement in Lusaka called Misisi Compound. So the way Misisi Compound developed was due to urbanization from the people from the village, and the spatial layout. My argument is that the spatial layout is based on mimicking their way of life in the village, and how but then when they came to town, those were temporal settlements. But my curiosity is to find out how we can use models such as Great Zimbabwe to try to improve our informal settlements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gezala. I've been thinking about informality quite a lot when I was supervising a thesis in development studies looking at the city of Tshwane. This is the modern town of the urban center of Pretoria and its metropolitan. Now, and I then got this theoretical understanding that informality is also part of urbanization, in the sense that at some stage in the growth of a city, one has to pass through that process of informality. One can also get back to that process of informality. It's an elastic process that that one can actually undergo and experience. So I wouldn't want to take models from Great Zimbabwe as such, because the data is so sketchy in terms of how you can read informality from the archaeological record. But I rather want to have cross-global comparisons in terms of how ancient cities developed, particularly in the Near East, and even in the Far East, how they developed and how they would want to read the materiality of informality. We can do that now, when we are looking at modern cities. How do we see people living in informal settlements? Are they always poor? Not necessarily the case, but why do they go through that stage as part of them trying to get to the formal? Is something that we need to understand. Why do we read material, cultural material in the archaeological record to say this is elite and non-elite? Perhaps it's simply how we fail to understand what informality is. So again, is leading me to question informality. I mean, theories of informality are leading me to question how we interpret elite settlements and non-elite settlements in the archaeological record. But it's something that needs to be tested, but cross globally, I think.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So Angus,
Thank you very much, Innocent, for your presentation. It's very nice to see you after a long time. I was interested in exactly the same question, actually, that you presented in your final slide, but it was really, it got me thinking about scale and in terms of understanding, taking, let's say, lessons from the past and trying to understand what we might do with them today and beyond. And do you see what issues do you see in terms of scale when you talk about, you talked about urbanization in Mesopotamia or wherever, but how do you scale those up to today's cities and mega cities? Is that a restriction, or is that something that you think you can do?
Thanks so much, Angus. It's so good to see you after a while, and perhaps it's time for you to come back to Pretoria for. Yours is quite a challenging one, in terms of how we should be looking at, cities, mega cities, or something in between today. And how we can use the past to try and make sense of what is going or what should not be going in them. What I can sense, though, is that cities are in trouble. When I look at Jackson, for example, in the US, where an entire city is not able to supply people with clean water, and water being the denominator, in any city, people need water beyond whatever they're going to drink after the water. They are in trouble. Even in South Africa here, when we look at that, we are importing water largely, especially in Pretoria and Johannesburg. We largely, depend on imported water. The question is, how long can we go with that, into the future? Will climate change allow us to do that? There are so many issues that I can raise. There are so many questions that I can raise, but I don't have answers to any of that. But I feel a sense of trouble, and possibly I want to project that sense of trouble when I look at some of the mega cities in the Near East in the past. Why do we see them in a ruinous state? Why did people leave them? What really went wrong? Again, I can't really sort of try and find a thread that links the past to the present, but there is that thread. And we should be, finding it. We should be detecting it. For Great Zimbabwe, there are some lessons to learn in terms of what not to do things. We always see rationality in terms of, people building, ancient monumental structures, but it may not have been that rational. Ultimately, it may not have been sustainable. Ultimately, when you see the size of those pits, when you see the water needs of a settlement, we haven't resolved the population issue, for example. But I honestly, can't help you here in terms of what should happen, other than saying we should try to extricate ourselves from trouble as much as is practically possible. Sorry, Angus.
No, it's fine. Thank you, Innocent.
So I put myself on to ask questions as well. So linking up to Angus' question on what you were discussing just now, and also the discussion on informal settlement. So I know the longevity of occupation in Great Zimbabwe is still debated. But I mean, Great Zimbabwe was actually occupied longer than many other centers that we know of. And relating to, I mean, now you've just shown us how people could live there for so long. But the question is more like, how could, the way I see the urban centers in Southern Africa is that they even they had monumental characters, they were also highly mobile and fluid. So as soon as you have the lineage dying out, or there's a shift in location, as we can see in later written documents. And maybe that is also, like, if we look at urban cities today, if we really trace the relations of the people living in those urban areas, the connection to the rural areas is super strong. When we have economic crises, people out-migrate from the cities, typically, because they can do that because the connection to the rural areas is so strong. So I think that's a link that can be made, make it easier for people to, be fluid, both in terms of economic policy. Today, people are surviving in informal settlements through an informal economy that is never measured because we don't know how to measure it. And the state tries to suppress that because they can't tax it. So,
Annalie, thanks for that. I take it as a comment. At least cities in the past had that opportunity, that elasticity, to interact with, the rural, and to be at least partly mobile, when they were no longer sustaining themselves at their present location. Now, when you try to compare that with what is happening today, and I can use the example of South Africa, and I can quote the Northern Province or Limpopo Province and Mpumalanga. And I went there looking at the so-called rural communities. Now, the word rural might disappear from the literature fairly soon because they are urbanizing very fast. From rural sort of context to sort of rural urban context to the urban context that we see in the cities. People are consciously trying to reduce mobilities between what used to be their city to their own context because they're busy recreating cities within their own context. Urban centers are just sprouting up like anything. So it is another dynamic in what I see happening, in South Africa, and the extent to which those communities in the rural areas back in the archaeological past also had this ideal, urbanization that they always that they would need to see around them. It is something that actually made me thinking to say, was this connection between rural and urban that permanent, or is it in a constant, state of shift from what is their city and what is the preferred, sort of urban sort of context? People are busy creating their own cities, and redefining space in ways they want. But to what extent are we doing that, or with the residents, let's say Great Zimbabwe and post Great Zimbabwe, also thinking along those lines? But I want to get their ideas by reading the materiality of, how mobile they were. So if I was to do, let's say, ceramics, for example, can mobility patterns be informed by looking at pottery and what people were thinking in terms of using that pottery in the context that they find themselves in? That would be a much more interesting way of looking at ceramics than simply looking at shape and decoration, for example. So, yes. So again, I'm not helpful there because we are raising a lot more questions than answers. And I think that's what it should be, to enrich the discussion and provide a cross-global comparative context in terms of how things could have functioned.
Great. Can I ask another question?
Yes,
and
why not,
that's
please.
more for Danny, who is here. So I mean, we're still lacking a paleoclimate record from near Great Zimbabwe, aren't we? And a vegetation record as well. Or I know people have tried core around Great Zimbabwe. Maybe you know more, Federica or Ezekiel. But
yeah, I'm not so sure to what extent the coring at Great Zimbabwe is going to, to assist us. But I still have hope that we can get something from them. It depends on what new methods and approaches are available to read the sort of the macros, the lithostratigraphies that the cores, can produce. But I want to acknowledge the work by Joseph Chikumbirike in terms of the charcoal. We can preface something in terms of what could have happened to the trees at least. So it all depends on the conversation that archaeology wants to have with paleobotanists and paleoscientists. And this is the barrier that I'm trying to break, because these disciplines are not close to all of us. And archaeology is best suited to relate to any of these disciplines, if we try to, find each other and we try to share the knowledge that each can provide, in terms, in one context such as Great Zimbabwe. And that's what I find very exciting.
great. Kisala, you had another comment.
Oh, yes, Professor, I would like to just take you briefly to, I'm sure you're very familiar with this book, Snakes and Crocodiles by Professor Hoffman. There's a part where he talks about how the people of the Zimbabwe culture, we're talking about Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, Kami, and etc., how they chose those settlements. One of them was, of course, soils, alluvial soils, good pastures, and there was also the issue of water. Now, for me, it is very strange. Like, for example, Kami settlement is placed very well along a river. Now, when you look at the case of Great Zimbabwe, and I think Mapungubwe, it's very strange that these settlements were placed in areas where maybe there was a long distance to water bodies. When you look at Great Zimbabwe, for example, where there's that lake, I'm sure it was a river before. I don't know whether it passed through Great Zimbabwe. When you also look at Mapungubwe, there's also should be the Limpopo or whichever river is a bit distant from those places. So now, yes, so it's, I'm just curious, how did they choose those in the context of water? I'm sure you've elaborated with the evidence of the LiDAR research, but just out of curiosity, how did they survive, or how do they choose those places and survive with in the context of water? Yeah,
definitely, Kezala, you're definitely right. I think what in my view, and I'm sure you all agree with me, water is key in terms of settlement location. I would not think, and let me start with Mapungubwe, I would not think that those who were settling at Mapungubwe would travel that distance, which is quite hilly, to get water from the Limpopo River. If you look at the sort of the hydrological setup of Mapungubwe, water must have been sourced locally, I think from within 200 meters or so, of the settlement. And the same, applies to Kami. I think Kami is well suited in terms of, settlement location. There's a river passing by. And that river, in my view, must have flowed permanently throughout the year, because it is actually fed by, crystalline basement rocks from the Matobo Hills. And it flows through, some of these swamps and flays, just west of the Matopos into west of Bulawayo, and then via Kami. So there was a source. I mean, it was a permanent source of water. It was really a strategic location. What is interesting about Great Zimbabwe is the fact that, that hilly location makes it, imperative that residents have to think differently when it comes to water storage and water management. And this is the reason why I try to engage the water issue here, because due to the runoff, due to the radial drainage pattern, one could not expect the residents to travel 3-4 kilometers or even 5 kilometers per day to source water to be able to sustain a structure or complex structures such as that one. It was simply impractical. So my view, as far as all those settlements were concerned, water was found locally, and there were efforts made by the residents to engineer water availability so as to constantly get it within a reasonable distance. So, you know, when we're dealing with the resource, be it you know, when we're doing site territorial analysis and things like that, we also have to look at how the ancients engineered the landscape so that some of these resources could be obtained very close by and not 5 or more kilometers, as some site territorial analysis would want us to believe. I acknowledge Dr. Ndukyake Ndlovu.
Thank you, Professor Pikirayi. Let me take this quick opportunity to make a few reflections. Firstly, I think, especially with regards to Mapungubwe, we also have to consider, you know, the issue of a flood level, that people cannot be, you know, so close to the river because of security issues. I went to Mapungubwe last year, and I was quite surprised because with over 20 years experience of going to Mapungubwe, I had never seen that amount of flooding on the Limpopo River. So I'm thinking that they must have known, you know, how unsafe it could have been to be too close to the river. But I also take your point that they must have had other sources of water without necessarily having to rely on the Limpopo River or even Shashi, you know, which is not too far as well. But just a few points to add on that. One, when we use the you know, the terminology informal and formal settlements in the context of these archaeological settlements that we are studying, what exactly do we mean there? You know, what benchmark are we using to say this is informal and this is you know, formal? Are we not just opposing our own, you know, viewpoints of today's societies on the societies of the past that you know, we are studying? That's the first point, which will then be based on the assumption that you know, probably if you were in a settlement where trade network was very much you know, critical, then you were in the so-called you know, formal settlement, and away from that, it's an informal settlement. Two, you spoke about ceramic studies, you know, in the context of understanding these societies, you know, like those who were living at Great Zimbabwe in much more detail. I have discomfort, you know, with the use of ceramic studies. You made a point that such studies should not just be focused on the shape and the decoration. Can you just add more on that point to say, if we don't just focus on the shape and the decoration, how best, other than that, can we use, you know, ceramic studies for them to really provide us with more insights in terms of the past? And lastly, and this is just a general comment, one of the things that I've always argued, just based on, you know, today's, you know, experience, is that I am of the view that a big society gets established around identity. So there must be one major leader who rises up and using the power they have, however attained, you know, everyone just follows them. But I've also of the view that once that particular individual dies, for example, it's very difficult for the hair to command exactly the same amount of power. And this is why I've often assumed that all these big societies should not really have had a situation whereby they were dominant for more than one generation, because I'm assuming that it would have been very difficult for the hair to take over. In fact, to conclude my point, I once made a judgment, and I said, with the Zulu royalty, which Professor Pikirayi will be very much familiar with, I said, if the last king departs, as he has now departed, it would be very difficult for the son taking over to command the same level of respect within government or within the society. And I'm already seeing elements of that. So I'm just thinking that while we can look at all kinds of factors behind the decline of these archaeological settlements, at times it is just around individuals, who were in power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndlovu, for your comments. I'll address two. The two questions that you raised initially, one on informal and informal settlements, in terms of how we benchmark the terms and try to use the very same to address the archaeological past. Archaeology by its very nature juxtaposes terminology, and while we try to assume or to believe that we are looking at the past or we are focusing on the past, we are still doing it in the present. So archaeology, in my view, is about the present. And unless you really go around reconceptualizing terms that try to address things in the past in the manner that they were used in the past, then there's no other way you can do some of these studies. Whether I can call it colonial or decolonial, but we are always thinking about the past in the present. That you cannot take it away. But what we are trying to do is, as people think about the past, we try as much as possible to get closer to the to the past in ways that are fairly modest, unassuming, and that take particular question in the way we use some of these terms. And that takes me to your comment on ceramic studies, where the issue that I was raising was, using ceramics to understand mobility patterns. I think the only pattern, as far as I know, ceramics in Southern Africa that is well known in terms of mobility is migrations. And that migrations have largely been based on the way we looked at ceramic shape and decoration. My particular view in terms of approaching that, in terms of approaching ceramics now, is to depart from those notions of creating identities based on typology, particularly shape and decoration, to something else. If we have to use typology, it must be socially meaningful. I did a paper in 2008 in Journals of Social Archaeology, where I tried to proffer alternatives to typology. Some did pay attention to that, but of course, I do understand the reason why typology has to remain, in most cases, the fundamental approach to doing archaeology in Southern Africa, because in some cases, there are regions where archaeology has not been done, and where you need to define a tradition based on pre-existing approaches. But I'm taking it a bit further because, to be honest with you, I'm fed up with that approach. What I'm doing, based on my interactions with colleagues at the Society of American Archaeology, meeting people from Central America, researchers from Central Asia, and having a conversation with ceramics, it is now possible, in my view, to try and address the bigger issues. And working on complex societies as I do, I'm now looking at ceramics from, what do ceramics mean, let's say, for complex societies, and how should we read them? Let's say, in terms of the stratigraphy, in terms of the decoration, and there are ways of doing that is very interesting. All what I'm calling for is a refreshing approach to looking at archaeology, that does not get us stuck into the past. Now, with regards to your comment on power and leaders, yes, that's the dynamic. I take your point, but remember, Great Zimbabwe did exist for 800 plus years under the same dynamic, but with different leaders. So it depends on what you are looking at, which societies you are dealing with. My next approach as far as the Zulu kingdom is concerned, and I'm working on that right now, is something that looks at the Zulu as a resilient kingdom, a kingdom that never fails. I mean, that never comes to an end. Why is that? Regardless of the leadership, and that takes us into the ethnographic record. Why is the Zulu kingdom never failing us? In terms of it being the kingdom that it was, either conceptually or even physically. I don't want to digress from Great Zimbabwe because I can see two hands from Danny and Ezekiel.
Good. So we will have to wrap up soon, and some people have already left us, and Federica needs to leave as well. But Danny and Ezekiel, you have the last. Ezekiel, you have the last question. Danny begin, and then Ezekiel.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Pikirayi, for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm a newcomer, so maybe I will make naive questions. So I have 3 of them. So it's about these dhaka pits. As I understand, they are human-made for building material, but also as a water reservoir. And can they be dated, or have they already been dated? So you showed you found many new ones, and can we distinguish different periods maybe?
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny, for that. I'll request to Dr. Solas there, because I think we did 2 dates. If I can hardly remember that. Federica, do you still remember? One was in the 16th century, and the other one was, yes, we did date them, but the results were inconclusive.
Sorry, yes, we did 2 dates. One was mid-16th century, and the other one, as far as I remember, Prof, was a bit earlier than that, so the mid-14th century.
Yeah.
But now, obviously, we have to revise this dating on the basis of new dates that we've obtained in the last season of fieldwork. So we'll do some Bayesian modeling, and hopefully we'll be able to narrow down maybe the time window that the 2 days that we have acquired from the dhaka pits.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Federica, for that.
Okay. Maybe a second question is, what would be the surface use of them? So is it possible there was some fishing, as I think you mentioned in your article 2016? How is that possible if they get dry?
Oh yeah, I mean, you still get fish. Remember, there is this fish that can stay and survive in mud for an entire season. I've forgotten the English name for it. But Ezekiel, do you know the name of the English name for Muramba? It's a mud fish. You get it across, in sub-Saharan Africa.
I think it's catfish or bubblefish.
I think it's the catfish.
Yeah.
The one
something
with
like that.
The one with whiskers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And last question, you mentioned there is a link between ritual and water conservation. Could you give us, explain a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, that would be a long story, but sometimes, in the Karanga culture, when you are conserving water, you always have to invoke the ancestral world. And it involves a series of rituals and sometimes ceremonies, to do that. And during the rain, the drought season, when you anticipate that the rains may or may not come in the next season, you invoke the ancestors and you play with them, and there are rituals to be followed and ceremonies to be conducted where you actually do what is called rain petitioning. And there are places where it is done. At Great Zimbabwe, it was done, at least, we know that from the 19th century onwards. But there are so many sites when these things, where rain petitioning is done. So that in itself shows you that intricate connection between water and the ancestors. It's not that something that falls and then people gather it. It's part of the ritualized world and part of local worldview.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, probably let me take the opportunity to just follow up on that question, which is related to what I wanted to ask. Are we able to now discuss the quality of the water itself in these reservoirs? I saw you were showing us graphs that indicate the quantity of the water. Are we able to do the same so far with the quality itself, given that the reservoirs are more like open air reservoirs and settlements around? What can you say about that?
Yeah, yes, I can say something. I did ask colleagues from Great Zimbabwe to test some of the waters, the open sort of source water from the growth point, and other reservoirs, around Great Zimbabwe in terms of toxicity and things like that. And they produced a draft called Fit for Royalty, which means that even though some of this water was, is exposed, the level of, toxicity was very low. Trace elements, were very low, and the water was safe for consumption. That could speak to Great Zimbabwe. But currently, given the changes that have taken place at Great Zimbabwe, I don't know to what extent, some of this water, or at least the aquifers, have been altered, in terms of, water composition. So tests are critical, but we need to do that knowing that, the landscape has changed as well.
Thank you so much, Prof. This is quite interesting.
Indeed. As I told you before, Ezekiel, it's one way of running away from archaeology to something much more challenging. If you just carry on with those ceramics, I'll run away.
I'll be joining you in water then.
Okay.
So great. I posted in the chat PR because this AFRHES seminar will reoccur every second month. So the first Monday every uneven month. And every even month, the first Monday, we will instead have the Lashes seminar, which is the Latin American and Caribbean seminar. So the next upcoming seminar is the Joel Gunn with the title, If the Future Past Teaches, What Does the Present Learn? So it really connects to what we have been discussing here. And then the next slot is the AFRHES. We still haven't filled that with the person, but that will be done. And all of it can be found on the iHope webpage. If you have seminar series you want to do PR for, we can put it there. So Federica de Garrett seminar is also listed there and with links and so on. Thank you very much, Innocent. It was a brilliant beginning.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure for me. You guys have a good evening, and good to see so many familiar faces, new ones, done.